Greetings all, Ferrari 601 here. In keeping with the launches of the 2019 Formula One cars, we have this, the Red Bull RB15. Yes, the 15th single-seater produced by Red Bull Racing for competition in Formula One. Here it is. Very cool to see this car. Of course, the brainchild of Adrian Newey, one of the most legendary designers in all of Grand Prix history. Adrian Newey, of course, has a very long and illustrious career all to his name, going back to the 90s, designing the March Leighton-House cars, and then later on with Williams designing the all-dominant FW14, 14B, 15. He had a spell with McLaren where he built the MP413, which also won a Constructors' Championship. Later on with McLaren, he also built the legendary MP418, legendary for a bad reason, but that came good in the 19, 19B, and 20, which almost won a championship, but hey, reliability. But really, in recent history, we know Adrian Newey for his work here with Red Bull, winning the Constructors' Championship in 2010, 2011, 2012, and 2013 with the ever-dominant RB6, 7, 8, and 9 chassis. So Adrian Newey, he has a very good design record on his CV, specifically with Red Bull. And here is his latest creation, the RB15. A note, first off, on what we see on the RB15, namely in terms of the livery here. Red Bull have been adamant to say that this car is not sporting the race livery. This is a test one, we are led to believe, from the Red Bull Brain Trust. Specifically, what they're doing with this livery, if you know a little bit of history, they are trying to camouflage things. You can see here, particularly on the front section of the monocoque, you can see these chevron patterns here. This is a paint scheme known as dazzle camouflage. And if you know something about history, you'll see pictures from World War I, and even in World War II, you'll see pictures of ships running out there at sea with paint schemes somewhat like these. The rationale behind a livery such as this, when you're talking about a ship anyway, is you're trying to obscure an object's apparent size, its apparent distance from the observer, as well as its apparent heading. Again, if you're in a submarine looking through a periscope, you see a pattern like this, it's going to be very confusing for you. It might take a little while to figure out what it is that you're looking at. Of course, in Formula One, everybody's running around on the same racetrack. We know where they're going and where they've been. But the effect is still maintained in terms of trying to break up an object's overall visual profile. You can see in this section here, we have got bargeboard activity, but I can't entirely tell you where it is, where it begins, and where it ends. Is this the bargeboard profile, or is this the bargeboard profile? I can't quite tell because we've got these chevron patterns here playing interference with us. So very cheeky and brilliant all the same move from Red Bull's design office, just trying to keep some of their secrets secret for a little bit longer, even though we have got the car here in front of us, in front of prying eyes. Anyway, regarding the actual design that we see here, starting off with the front wing, here it is in that chevron delta profile, as we have seen since 2017, Red Bull choosing to subdivide their wing into individual flap elements, as we've been seeing on several other cars. Looks like we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 flap elements on this wing. In addition to it, we have got this profile on the end plates there. Have a look. About the rearmost 30% of the top side of the end fence, it is flared outward a little bit. Very reminiscent of what we've seen on Haas. I have to assume that flaring the end plate out a little bit like this is an attempt to send some of that air around the front tires there, because of course the teams have lost a lot of the outwash effect that they've had in previous years due to the absence of winglets and cascade elements in this section of the main plane. All of that deleted by the FIA rules makers in the name of dirty air management. So just like Haas, it looks like Red Bull are attempting to steer air around the front axle just to minimize the drag and turbulence that comes off of these front tires. So again, maybe a little bit of a cheeky solution on their part, because we're led to believe that these end fences are supposed to be just straight across with no deviation. But we've seen other teams do it. We'll see if the FIA have anything to say about it. Last note on the front end of the car, we have got Red Bull's nose solution, very similar to what they've been running over the last 2 years. It looks like we have a hollow channel running down from the nose tip to the inside of the nose, which evidently is going to be exiting up top here through an S-duct solution. They're not even trying to hide that. Very interesting. But aside from that, very conventional to what we've been seeing on the rest of the Red Bull cars in recent years. Moving toward the midsection now on this car. We've got a lot of activity here, but it all looks very well thought out and very well integrated, similarly to what we were talking about on the Mercedes a few days ago in terms of what they were doing with their wing mirror stalks. Here's the support stalk here on the Red Bull. Mercedes had integrated theirs with another little flying buttress winglet connecting it to the turning vane. Red Bull have not done that. However, they have done something very interesting with the turning vane profiles. First off, we can see our radiator inlet here, very small and very high, and even subdivided letterbox opening here, very high on the side pod, very reminiscent of what Ferrari have been doing over the last couple of seasons. However, Red Bull have taken it a step further. In addition to the actual opening we have got here on the side pod for the radiator, we have a secondary profile running right underneath. This is not part of the side pod. What this is a support strut for the turning vane that we can see here, and that continues in its profile all the way down to the reference plane, roughly like this in this outline. Very intricate, and of course you've got that support strut there just giving you some aero cleanliness, I suppose we could say, as we're trying to feed the radiator ducts there. Very cool, and again, very nice display of part integration. In addition to that, though, we have one other feature about the turning vanes on this car, which is very interesting. Have a look right here. We have got ourselves some sort of flying buttress support strut in big inverted commas there, because that's not really what it is. Yes, it is adding a little bit more rigidity to these turning vanes, but integrating this strut with the lower section of the turning vane through here, that is definitely sending a little bit more air around the side pod and then feeding the floor, feeding the top side of the diffuser. Very nice part integration once again on the part of Adrian Newey. Very cool. Pulling back a little bit, here is that barge board section that we mentioned. Again, somewhat broken up by those chevrons in the livery, so I can't quite divine what the actual profile is, but we have got ourselves at least 1, 2, 3 distinct elements of this barge board, perhaps a fourth, and perhaps even a fifth a little bit farther forward. It's hard to tell from this shot, but very intricate designs here, and note the sawtooth pattern on top of this barge board structure. It's very intricate, and of course, they are trying to generate areas of low pressure so that they can get that air to attach itself to the side pod and then feed the rear a little bit more cohesively in a more laminar flow there. Again, trying to minimize turbulence in this area. If you get any detachment in the airflow here, it could be catastrophic for your downforce generation. Speaking of airflow across the midsection of the car, have a look at how much they've been able to shrink wrap this bodywork around this section of the car. It is absolutely shrink wrapped, which means, remember, Red Bull going to Honda engines this year. This indicates that Honda have got a very mature and well-developed package. They're happy with the cooling requirements. They've probably been able to mitigate some of the cooling problems that we've seen them have with McLaren and occasionally Toro Rosso in years gone by. Therefore, they've given Red Bull and Adrian Newey okay to shrink wrap everything, which means, guess what? You have got all of this empty space to play with to feed the diffuser. And the more empty space you have, the more air you can ram into that diffuser, the cleaner that air is going to be, meaning more downforce generation, meaning better performance, better lap time, and better race results. Again, we'll see if the Honda is reliable for the Red Bull, but to see the bodywork being shrink wrapped already pre-season, that tells me that they're very happy with where their engine is in terms of cooling, and, well, they've given Red Bull the okay to shrink wrap everything. Very encouraging. And on this next shot here, looking at the car from straight on, zoomed in a bit, we can't see the entirety of the front end here, but we do see some great, more macrocosmic detail going on with some of the more intricate elements on this car. First off, the front suspension running across the front here from left to right. Here we have wishbone, wishbone, and upright double wishbone push rod front suspension on this Red Bull. As we've come to expect here, yet another 2019 F1 car with a push rod front suspension. Also on this shot, remember the turning vane detail that we were talking about previously? Well, here we go, and it is very intricate. First off, here is that strut supporting the outboard section of the turning vane, connecting it to the monocoque in that section there. Very nice design, very reminiscent of what we've seen from Mercedes thus far. And in addition to that, here are the wing mirror support struts running to the side of the monocoque there. Notice very far outboard are those mirrors mounted. So again, this appears to be in reaction to the drivers complaining a little bit about rear visibility, looking back toward this section out here over the rear tire, trying to see if anybody is there on your quarter panel. Again, moving the mirrors a little bit farther outboard helps greatly with driver visibility when you're running in close quarters with somebody else. And also, just overall with the location of these mirrors, have a look. There's the side of the monocoque. There is roughly center of the mirror. Look how far outboard they are nowadays. Remember the designs that Ferrari and McLaren started to pioneer in the mid-2000s, moving their mirrors outboard, putting them on these long stalks coming off of the side pods? This is more or less the same mounting location now for these mirrors now in 2019. So it's cool to see this solution coming back. Obviously, the FIA, if they had their way, they would want the teams to mount their mirrors right here and right here at either side. But you notice the sight lines moving directly back, you're looking at your own halo there. That doesn't help. So moving the mirrors outboard, helping with driver visibility for sure. In addition to that, of course, look at your support struts for the mirrors. Red Bull here, very much like Mercedes, they are following a twin strut design, integrating it there with the support pylon for the turning vane, so you can get a sense of what they're doing aerodynamically as they're trying to funnel air around the midsection of this car, getting it into the radiator duct, which runs roughly here. Very cool. As well as trying to steer some of that airflow through the midsection, getting it to attach to the top side bodywork, as well as steering some of that air around the bottom side of the top side bodywork, around the reference plane here, getting it to attach and then feed the diffuser here, working from front to rear. Very cool. Also from this shot, that visual profile, not as much breaking up due to the camouflage paint scheme. So now we can get a sense of what our barge board profile is, at least here on the top side. Lots of sawtooth patterns here going on with the barge boards on either side. Very intricate design, and of course, this is still attempting to funnel air around the front of the monocoque and get it to attach around the rear section there through the side pod profile, as we mentioned, very shrink wrapped to feed the floor and the diffuser toward the rear. Very cool shot. And on this next one, now we have got the RB15 out on track at Silverstone. Much like Mercedes, Red Bull releasing these pictures to the public and then immediately taking the car out on track for its first shakedown run. Here it is. This is the car that they will be bringing to Barcelona, barring a few relatively minor updates, I'm led to believe. Due to the exposure on this shot, we can't see all that much through the front end of the car. It's just partially shadowed here. They've obviously set the exposure for the midsection of the bodywork as well as what's going on in the background here. But we can see the overall attitude of the car. Notice it does not appear that they're running all that much rake relative to the Mercedes. Remember that profile shot we took a look at with the Mercedes, and they were running a very substantial amount of rake. This Red Bull appears to be sitting much more level relative to the ground in relation to what we saw from the Mercedes. Of course, this is a shakedown run, so we are not at all expecting this car to be in qualifying or race trim here. But you can see it is running a bit more flat relative to the ground, so perhaps a slightly different idea going on with Red Bull in terms of weight distribution as well as aerodynamic efficiency. Of course, if you want to get consistent aero numbers, you want to have as stable a platform as possible. That's why they run these cars with such high and stiff spring rates. They don't want all that much vertical deflection up and down in terms of your heave springs. So again, if you can keep everything straight and level, you can get all of your aero bits working as efficiently as possible. So perhaps that's what Red Bull are doing here. But on this shot, a couple things that we can now see, because we've got that contrast with the background. Have a look at these horizontal winglets on either side. These are not quite turning vanes. These are just little supplemental winglets, which appear to be funneling air underneath the profile of those winglets. Again, probably trying to get it to attach itself to that rear side bodywork remember, working in conjunction with the turning vanes that we can see through this section. Very cool to see. Also on this shot, readily apparent double profile on the rear wing end fences. Of course, we've only got the right fence visible here due to the angle, but we have one leading edge and then we have a secondary leading edge. They have split the end fence roughly in that section where I've drawn the horizontal bold line, very much in keeping with what Haas and Mercedes have done thus far. Not as an extreme a solution as Mercedes have done in terms of running a well-defined crease here through the end fence, but Red Bull choosing to split it, have a vertical strake here, and then have this profile follow the more traditional bent section here that we've been seeing on all the wings since 2017. Very cool to see. Also, what's cool to see on this car is the absence of that swan neck mounting profile that we saw on the Mercedes. This still has a very more or less conventional strut supporting the rear wing, and of course here is your DRS actuator pod here to open and close the slot gap, which we can see here. Of course that slot gap is going to be a bit wider this year, but there it is, readily apparent. Obviously the DRS is closed in this particular shot, but when that opens up, this pod here will push this profile of the main plane upward and open up that slot gap, cut down on some drag and increase some straight line speed, perhaps helping overtaking a little bit. But again, very cool to see the car out there on track already before they even get to Barcelona. Very cool. And on this next shot, now looking at the car from profile, a little bit more of an angle than direct 90 degrees, but you can see here, notice we have got a different tire compound now on this car. We've got the blue sidewalled wet weather tires for this shakedown run, and also notice a big difference from what we saw in the previous shot. Here is the relative ride height from the reference plane to the ground on the front, and then relative ride height from the reference plane to the ground on the rear. Here is a bit more rake dialed into this car. The whole thing is sloping downward a bit now. This is what we would expect to see. Perhaps because this is obviously another run than we saw in the previous shot, different tires fitted to the car. Have they dialed in some rake for this run? Potentially, but there is the rake now that we would expect to see on these Formula One cars, basically to help with aero, again accelerating air underneath the car to shoot it up out of the back, and of course weight distribution as well. You want to get a lot of that rear bias toward the front axle to help with responsiveness on turn-in, otherwise the thing would just understeer forever. So interesting to see different ride height solutions going on with shakedown day for Red Bull. But also here you can get the full effect now of this camouflage livery, more chevrons running across the midsection of the engine cover with some high contrast colors as well. We've got red and then gray and then a blue chevron running through this section here underneath the B in Red Bull. Definitely they are playing trickery with that livery. It's difficult to get a sense of, for example, here on the rear wing end fences, it's difficult to see whether or not they have cut any sort of gills or nacket ducts in this section simply because of the way the colors are contrasting with one another, as well as how the shadows are falling across the profile in this section here. Is there a duct in this area? Maybe, maybe not. I don't know, simply because the colors are playing havoc with my eyes. But here you can definitely get a sense of the overall proportions of the turning vanes here across the midsection of the car. Very aggressive and very intricate profiles working there. Very, very nice. Also interesting to see their pitot array here. Very different sort of design than we've seen on other cars. Typically they run just a triangular bit of carbon in this section here to hold some pitot tubes, but Red Bull, they appear to have this freestanding structure on top of the car. I don't know if that's just there for testing or if they intend to run that for the balance of the season, but definitely a little bit of a different approach than we've seen from some other teams in previous years. And on this next shot, this is a very high resolution shot of the rear of the RB15. And this is the first time in 2019 that we have seen the rear end of one of these cars in such detail. So let's play. First of all, we have got our diffuser geometry running from the reference plane up across this section here and then working down again as we see the full profile of the diffuser in full view here. We've got strakes running through the bottom section of the diffuser in roughly this sort of geometry. Very cool to see all of that. More strakes coming down from the top toward the ground here. But notice just how much space we have underneath the car. This is the step plane running through here. So that's the very bottom of the car where the legality plank will be mounted. And then in these raised sections here, we have got the reference plane proper. Remember, the bottoms of these Formula One cars are stepped. That was a rule that was instituted for 1995 in reaction to Imola 1994. Prior to that, the cars had flat bottoms, and even before that, they had tunnels cut into the underside, very much like you still see on an Indy car today. But the step plane in Formula One since 1995, again, remember on the Mercedes video, the lower you can run an aerodynamic surface toward the ground, the faster the flow underneath the car is going to be, meaning more negative pressure underneath the car, thereby resulting in a net down load, down force. So again, that's still a vestige of the FIA taking action all the way back in the mid-90s to limit down force. We still see that profile on Formula One cars today. However, other details we can see on this shot. Here is that ride height from the step plane, the very bottom of the car, to the ground, and then in front, quite a severe amount of rake now dialed onto this Red Bull on this second run, because here's your wet weather tire once again. So again, there were at least 2 runs on shakedown day. In addition to that, we can zoom in quite a lot on this shot because it's very high resolution, but here's the exhaust arrangement on the Red Bull. Here we have got our principal turbine exhaust, as we would expect to see, and on either side, partially obscured here by the rear crash structure, we have got wastegate exhaust number 1 and wastegate exhaust number 2. So Honda still running the same overall exhaust geometry here. You've got your primary turbine exhaust and then wastegate 1, wastegate 2 right there, still in that triangular pattern as we have come to expect from the Honda engined cars. Very cool. Also very cool to note on this shot, have a look at the angle of the turbine exhaust coming out of that engine cover. It is angled somewhat upward relative to the bottom side of the rear wing main plane. Remember Renault in 2018, we saw some heat treating on the rear wing main plane in this section here as they had deflected their turbine exhaust up toward the rear wing main plane. Red Bull evidently are doing something rather similar. I believe the limit in terms of deflection vertically for this exhaust is plus or minus 5 degrees. So you can see there is a little bit of a slope on this shot. Not much, but probably it is within that 5-degree limit. So they are evidently trying to affect the airflow coming off of the engine cover through the profile of that rear wing. And again, just trying to energize the flow a little bit via the exhaust flow to try and energize that flow and generate a little bit more downforce through downwash off of the engine cover. Very cool. Also on this shot for the first time in 2019, we can see those rear lights integrated to the rear wing end fences on either side. This is a new rule for 2019. In addition to the rain light here on the rear crash structure, which we've seen for decades now in Formula One, we have got these 2 lights on the rear wing end fences. This is just an attempt to increase visibility toward following drivers so that these cars are easier to see when they're following closely in the rain, as well as just overall information for other drivers. These rear lights, in addition to flashing in the rain or in pit lane, they also illuminate when the car in front is doing lift and coast. In other words, when they're regenerating power, harvesting power off of the rear axle, which does result in a net braking effect. So if you're following close behind, I imagine the drivers appreciate just a little bit more of a visual heads up that the car in front may well start slowing down significantly. I don't know if they're also going to be using these lights as traditional brake lights. I don't think there's anything in the regulations that necessarily prohibit that, but they may also be using these lights as brake lights like you would see on an LMP1 car, for example. So again, we've got these lights on the rear wing end fences, and honestly, they're not that noticeable from an aesthetic point of view. I don't think they look bad, but if they do help increase visibility in wet weather conditions, I'm all for it. Very cool to see. Last detail on this shot, here's your rear suspension geometry once again, partially obscured due to the angle, but lower wishbone, upper wishbone, and then pull rod, which will come in on this side, most likely through here, and on this other side of the car, there's your pull rod geometry. Very cool. And your upper wishbone and lower wishbone. So double wishbone, pull rod confirmed on the rear of this Red Bull, once again, from a slightly different vantage point. Very cool. And again, this high resolution shot, it is unheard of to see something like this from a Formula One car on launch day. There is your profile of the reference plane. Again, following that bend in this section here, very cool. And again, your barge board detail, a little bit of pixelation as we've zoomed in quite a lot now, but there it is. There is your nose profile on the car. Again, everything is compressed due to the angle, but the really complicated geometries of the turning vane and barge board area on the car here for all to see. Very cool. Very, very cool. And again, our angles are very severe here, so everything is being compressed visually. But here it is. There's that flying buttress section that we noted on the first picture, linking up with the reference plane there. Very, very intricate design. Here is a partial view of the barge board. These would be the two rearmost panels of that barge board. Obviously, we wouldn't be able to see what's forward of this due to the angle, but very intricate designs. And also, speaking of intricacy, we mentioned how shrink-wrapped that bodywork is. Here's the apparent profile from this perspective of the side pod. Very, very tight. And again, that means you get more air flowing through here, attaching to the bottom side of the bodywork, feeding the diffuser toward the back, which then means more efficiency as you blow that air through the diffuser and then out through the bottom of the car, both on the top side as well as the bottom side of the diffuser. Finally, you can see some slot gaps in the diffuser itself. We saw this in 2017 and 2018, but just through here, these little slot gaps, the idea here being you can pressurize the air coming through here, and again, when you increase the speed of a flow, its pressure drops and you get more downforce. So again, very cool aero wizardry going on from the mind of Adrian Newey. And on our last shot here, again, we have got the wet weather tires fitted to the car, so this is a different run than the first shot relatively from this angle that we saw, and we can confirm this again. They have dialed more rake into the car, front and rear there, so the difference in ride height also apparent. Also on this shot, we can see the geometry of that nose tip now, with that center channel running through here, which evidently is feeding an S-duct, which will be exhausting roughly through this section there. Very, very cool. And there is our front wing profile, our neutral center section here, and then we have a slight upturn in the leading edge profile of the wing as we head outboard to the end fences. Again, they are trying to take advantage of that spoon effect a little bit. Notice, though, that we've got a little bit of a negative curve going on here. We initially turn up through this section, and then we very sharply turn down again to the end fence area. Very cool. This is probably an attempt to recapture a little bit of outwash. Again, just trying to funnel air away from the front end, away from those front tires, cut down on some drag, but interesting to see there. Also, there is our inverted U channel running on the extreme outboard profile of the end fence. Again, this is another attempt at outwash, create some venturis through here just to funnel air away from the front axle and cut down on drag from those tires. But yes, very interesting to see the apparent change in ride height that is visible on these shots, even from the shakedown runs on launch day. Very, very cool. Ultimately, I've got to say this Red Bull looks like a very cohesive and well thought out package already, even in launch spec. And again, because the car is out on track, we can expect to see something quite similar to this, perhaps with a few different pieces fitted, but we will see this at Barcelona. And for the moment, in terms of the visual presentation and the part integration with all of this, it appears to be put together very nicely, very cohesive, very cogent, and well thought out from the Red Bull Brain Trust. So definitely I'm expecting this car to be competitive immediately. The only unknown in this is the Honda engine. Red Bull, again, moving from Renault power to Honda power. Honda, they don't have the best reliability record on the grid, but perhaps they have finally gotten it together, and Red Bull and Adrian Newey will be able to do something spectacular this year. It's a little bit of a long shot, but with them being as aggressive as they have been in the midsection of the car, packaging everything so tightly, just maybe Honda have made some inroads on reliability, and they can give Red Bull the reliability and horsepower they need to be very competitive in 2019. From an aerodynamic standpoint, they're already there as far as I'm concerned. Could this car be the best of the rest? P3 in the championship? We shall find out in due course. But that's all I've got for you on the Red Bull RB15. Very excited about this car, and I think it looks very nice. I can't wait to see what they do in Barcelona. Until next time, thank you all very much for watching. Ferrari Man 601 saying thank you, and of course, we will see you soon.